Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We will be presenting 4 ways MEP contractors can build better estimates. I'm here with Ron King, who will be presenting the main content. A couple of items to discuss before we get started. If you do have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask your questions. There's a Q&A section on the GoToWebinar application. Type your questions in there, and then we will do our best to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. If there are questions that we are not able to get to today, we will follow up with you individually or through an FAQ document that we will distribute following the webinar. Also, the webinar will be recorded and distributed in a follow-up email tomorrow. So in terms of, we'll go through the agenda of what we're going to cover today. We'll be covering first the importance of applying labor factors. Second, covering your labor risk ratio. Third, recognizing the true costs associated with varying site conditions. And fourth, impacts associated with spreadsheet errors. So we hope that you enjoy these best practices today that will help you to build better estimates. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron King to present the main content.
Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody is doing fine. Thanks for joining this educational webinar. And real quickly, before we get started, I'll just give you just a couple facts about myself. I joined Trimble MEP in 2006, and I'm responsible for our estimating solutions globally. Prior to joining Trimble, I was employed for 17 years with a mechanical multi-trade contractor out of Toledo, Ohio. And as far as outside of the Trimble, my duties are I co-chair of the MCA WebLim committee, which is responsible for the formulation of labor units that we use in mechanical estimating, and also a member of the Pipe Fabrication Institute PFI engineering committee. So those are the 2 committees that I serve on for the mechanical industry. So during my contracting days, we typically learned or shared best practices through peer groups, or we attended educational sessions at association meetings like MCA or NECA or PHC or some others. But Trimble's webinars, such as this one, are geared for educational purposes to be able to help contractors who aren't involved in any of those peer groups. So I hope you find this webinar informative. And let's start it off with talking about the topic of applying labor factors. So let's take a minute and think about what things affect your company's productivity. Then we'll think about the things that affect a job site's productivity. So your company's productivity, certain things affect that for sure, such as your project management system. And is that project management software robust? Is it easy to use? Does it control material and labor costs well? Does it have a change order module that is easy to use and is very robustful? What about your pre-planning process, your job handoff, or the post-job review? All projects require some form of pre-planning or handoff. So whether the job is small or large, an estimator needs to transfer that scope of work to the person that's going to be doing the installing. So there's varying degrees of those different handoffs. What about the safety policies of your company? How does that affect your company's productivity? No more can we just run up a ladder or get in an aerial lift without being properly tied off. What about your lockout tagout procedures, or if you happen to have any confined space requirements that you have to follow? And what about if you employ toolbox talks? You use those, on the job site to have toolbox talks regularly. All those things affect your company's productivity. And company expertise, doing what you do really well and trying to stay out of the weeds of doing things that you may not know. That's certainly something that would affect your productivity if you got into an area that you don't usually work in. Conditions of the age of your tools certainly affect your productivity. So, the newer the tools or the better the joining processes are. Some of those new joining processes have new tools for them. That certainly would affect the productivity with your company. And how about that move to cordless tools as opposed to corded tools, and making sure the batteries are plugged in, at all times so that we're not dead in the water. What about the geographical sweet spot of your company? So, geographically, where is that sweet spot? What radius around your office or the home office, do you normally do your work? And getting outside of that sweet spot, could affect your company's productivity. How about your prefabrication opportunities, where we're really trying to drive hours out of the field and get them into a controlled environment? Or how about the training, such as your foreman training or PM training? In my contracting days, one of the things that we would regularly do on our foreman training is, talk about reporting topics, because a lot of times the foreman's job is that, reporting back, how things are going. So making sure that they understood all the forms and everything they needed to fill out, and also bringing vendors in and doing vendor training. I can remember specifically at one time, when we brought a vendor in, and it was Hilti, and they were showing us its new speed hanger, where the side of a clevis hanger opened up like a door, so that you put in all of the hangers and then come back with the doors open or the side open on them, put your pipe in, close the doors on the hanger. So this kept you from having to support the hanger and awkwardly try to get that clevis around it. So that type of training always helped the foremen on new material installations or joining processes. So just like a job site, in our office here, we have a little bit of construction going on, so I hope the background noise isn't too bad, so I apologize for that. And then as far as, PM training goes, we would do scheduling training, cost control training, estimating, of course, and any business writing. So any type of training that you could do would obviously affect your productivity as well. Now let's talk about what things will affect your job site productivity. So the geographical location of the job site certainly would affect the job site's productivity. If you're outside of the sweet spot that you normally work in, do you have to pay per diem to get the craftspeople there? And then also job site logistics is probably the biggest thing that will affect your productivity, and we'll be talking more in depth about job site logistics further on in the presentation. Adverse temperature and weather could certainly affect that job site's productivity, as well as design completeness. We continue to hear how design still is no better than it ever was. In fact, I even hear that it's even worse, but that opens up the RFIs and all the questions. So lack of completeness equals questions and RFIs that have to be dealt with, either in the pre-job process or on the job site. Also, stacking of trades. So the particular area that you're supposed to be working in, are there other trades in that area? And is the area really too small to have everybody in it? That could obviously impact your productivity. How about reassignment of work powers? So your pre-planned activities for the day, you show up on the job site, you've got the tools and material to do it, but the general foreman says, the general contractor that you're working for says, sorry, you can't be in this area today. Something has happened. You've got to go to a different area of the job. So now your pre-planned activities are no longer valid for that day. So reassignment of manpower is a big problem. How about multitude of change orders? The more incomplete the drawings, the more opportunity there is for a multitude of change orders that affect that job site's productivity. Material and tool storage is probably one of the biggest things that would affect the job site productivity and falls under, job site logistics. But, certainly where the tools and material is stored in relation to where the job site is actually at is a big problem. Uncontrolled breaks or lunches, late starts or early quits certainly affect your job's productivity, as well as owner-provided equipment. So let's talk about some labor factoring here. So what's the difference between a performance factor and a correction factor? The performance factor is a factor that we apply to the labor hours based on the historical data from past projects of similar size and nature. And if you're using an association set of labor hours such as MCA or NECA or PHCC, you'll be factoring those hours because, of course, they're not your company's labor units. They're not tailored just for you. So you're going to have to apply some type of factoring onto those labor hours. Or do you use your own homegrown labor hours that perhaps you maybe don't factor? But regardless of the method that you use, comparing historical data from past projects or similar sizes in nature is very important. You might also consider performance factoring by system. So some examples of that would be like your heating water system versus your sanitary DWV, or on the electrical side, maybe feeders versus branch circuits. So however you might want to set up those different systems, you certainly could factor those differently as far as your performance factor goes, how well your company installs those types of things under normal circumstances. However, correction factors are a little bit different. They're applied to adjust the labor hours either up or down at the time of the line item detail or during takeoff. That's what we call line item detail. Or they could be applied on the entire estimate at the end of the estimate. So let me talk a little bit about each of those. So line item detail, that's where a certain portion of the work is, say, 20 feet high versus somewhere else on the project, maybe 8 feet high. So while you're encountering that height, you would apply the labor factor until that condition no longer exists. Or at the entire estimate level, you would apply that at the very end during your general conditions, such as a winter factor. If the project was in Minnesota or something, then you could apply that labor factoring in the closeout section, as opposed to the line item detail. So there's a couple of different ways of factoring for both performance and correction factors. So before we can talk about correction factors really any further and how to apply them, you'll really need to think about the basic assumptions of your estimating system. And this is one of the things that I encourage each of you to do when you return back to your desks, or when you have some spare time, hopefully you have some spare time, is to think about what are the basic assumptions of your estimating system. And I really believe that everybody should clearly understand these. Some examples of that would be like, would you use the same labor units for material installed at 25 feet high as compared to 6 feet high? Well, certainly not. So at what height would you require to start applying a correction factor? So if you don't have those documented, your basic assumptions, I would suggest that you do so. This would really help as your company grows and you hire new estimators. This will help them understand the foundations that your labor units are based upon. Because, at the end of the day, they may think that it's okay to not apply a labor factor, say at 15 feet high, where you had been applying a labor factor at 10 feet high all along. So understanding and knowing those basic assumptions and distributing them within your estimating department is really important. So here's some example of some of the different categories that I might suggest that you apply labor factoring for is below grade. So if you happen to be 10 feet deep as opposed to 4 feet deep, or above grade if you're 25 feet high as opposed to 6 feet high. How about environmental conditions such as excessive heat or cold? Or is that lighting in the area that you're going to be performing the job, is it adequate, or is the ventilation adequate? Those are some environmental concerns or conditions that you might apply some type of correction factors for because of those out of the normal situations. How about job conditions such as the material laydown area, or your restroom location, or your break room location? Those are all very important as to how quick you can get the work put in, because if they have to go a long distance for each of those areas, obviously that's going to impact your labor. And also working on a reasonably flat surface. If you're trying to get in there with scissor lifts and you're not on a reasonably flat surface, you can obviously in your mind picture that what you'd be dealing with there as opposed to an articulating lift. So anyways, these are just some examples. There's many, many more reasons that you might want to apply a factor to your job, but there's some good guidelines to go by. All of your basic assumptions should be documented, and this way other estimators can use those within your company. So very important on basic assumptions. So this particular slide, I like to use this as a little bit of an illustration. It's kind of corny, but I think it gets the point across. Let's talk about correcting at the line item detail and applying a labor correction factor. So we'll take, for example, and it really doesn't matter if this is a mechanical example or electrical. I happen to have a mechanical one on here. We could just as easily do an electrical. But if we wanted to look at the labor units for a 4-inch carbon steel standard weight butt weld 90-degree elbow, MCA says that the labor hours for the installation of that 90 is 4.84 hours. Well, if we go and we read the basic assumptions of the MCA estimating manual, those basic assumptions actually form the outer walls of a box. And within that box, you'll have the 4.84 hours floating around on the inside of that box, depicted on the left side of the screen there. When a job site condition such as height impacts that installation, then a height factor must be applied. And in the example I used here, I just used a 10% example. We're adding 10% because of the height that we're working at to install this elbow. That 4.84 hours now becomes 5.32, shown on the right. So once that factor is applied, it basically brings that labor units back within the box that is bounded by my basic assumptions. So I hope that makes sense. A little corny example, but I like to use that one. Once that factor is applied, the labor unit is back inside the box. And some examples of being outside of that box could be like reduced work height factor, like working in a crawl space. So if all of this particular part of the job, or all of the job is working in a crawl space, and the installer is bent over all day long, obviously it's going to affect your labor hours. Or if it's an environmental factor because it's in Minnesota in the wintertime and it's cold. Or how about if a general condition factor such as congestion in the mechanical room. All of these factors will impact your labor and should be corrected when those impacts occur. If the condition applies to the entire project, apply that factor at the end of your estimate in the closeout sheets. But if the condition applies to only a certain portion of the estimate, apply it at the line item detail during your takeoff. Or in other words, doing your takeoff when the condition exists. And another way to illustrate that line item takeoff factor would be if you're installing at 8 foot high across a room, and then all of a sudden, and no factoring is applied to that, and then all of a sudden you penetrate through a wall and that ceiling jumps up to 20 feet high across a room, that height factor would be applied as you cross that 20-foot ceiling until that condition no longer exists and you drop back down to the 8 foot, for example. So there's some examples of applying labor factor correction factoring. So here's some examples of when to apply labor correction factoring, additional to what we just talked about, working in a ditch deeper than 4 feet. Working in a tunnel, that's kind of like you're working in a crawl space. Tunnels can be tricky. They have horrible access to them usually, but and getting material into their material and tools can be tricky sometimes. So I'd certainly apply some type of a factor for working in a tunnel. Multi-story buildings above the 3rd floor. Now, you might argue, well, working above the 1st floor would probably take some type of a factoring, but that's cool. Just if that's what is in your basic assumptions, then that's something that you would note. So anything above the 1st floor then would require some type of a labor factor. Now, you would also argue that once I have my material on the floor, I should be able to install it on, say, the 4th floor just as quickly as I can on the 1st floor. I agree with that once the material is already there, but certainly it takes extra labor to get the material up onto those additional floors. So that's where you would apply some type of a correction factor. Also, working above a suspended ceiling. We all know the impacts of doing that, removing ceiling tiles, putting ceiling tiles back. Did you break any tiles, and then trying to get our work, whether it's pipe or conduit, above that ceiling can be tricky. Working in excessively hot or cold areas, obviously, is where we touched on that one. We would apply a factor for that. Inadequate lighting, stacking of trades. You're in a very small area. All the trades are in there working. That's going to impact your labor. Working in owner-occupied areas and having to erect dust enclosures also would impact your labor. So adjusting those labor hours based on those job conditions will certainly help mitigate any of your labor risk. So I'm a huge advocate for factoring at the line item detail as you do your takeoff. And this will account for situations that aren't within the basic assumptions of your labor units that you use to bid your work. So ignoring labor factoring can be very risky business. So now let's talk about labor risk ratio. There may be this may be a term that you're familiar with, others maybe not so much. So let's dive in here and talk about labor risk ratio. So how do we make up, or how do we mark up the costs that are contained in our estimates? So markup is really comprised of two things, overhead and profit. And we need to really look at those two things separately, in my opinion. So let's talk first about what is overhead and then what is not overhead. So overhead is all the costs that a contractor incurs, even if there's no work. So the home office rental, the property taxes, utilities, all associated with the home office, the office equipment, the furniture, supplies, your licenses, the dues or subscriptions, your auto or business insurance, advertising, sales, and marketing, and your office salaries. All of these things and more all make up what your overhead is comprised of. So really, to sum that up, overhead is really all the costs required to keep the lights on for an entire year in your home office. If you have multiple offices, obviously those are included as well, but it doesn't include like a job site office. So think about, a home office, everything in that home office to keep the lights on for an entire year. That is overhead. So what is not overhead? So any job expenses that are not overhead, such as the job site's office and utilities and expenses associated with that job site office, or the estimates that have become a project. Now let's talk about that one a second. In my opinion, the estimate as it's being worked on before it becomes a job is really overhead, because you don't know if you're going to get that job. Once that estimate becomes a project, then I would suggest that you be very aggressive on making sure that those overhead costs incurred during that estimating phase get charged to the project or transferred over onto the project. This will help keep that overhead number within check. So if you're very aggressive on moving job costs from overhead over to the jobs, that'll help that overhead number be lower. But of course, you've also got to account for those job costs in your estimate then. Estimating change orders. Obviously, it's a change order. You've already got the project, so any estimating cost incurred to do that change order is not overhead. Your project management of that project is certainly not overhead. That's running the project. And job site administrative staff, if it's large enough to have that, certainly is not overhead. How about your drafting department? As long as they're working on a project for the field, that is not overhead. Material purchase for the field or the bonding for that particular project is not overhead. So defining what is and what is not overhead is very important. So profit that you put on a job, as we estimate that, should correlate to the risk that you'll be taking if you're awarded that job. So I've broken it down into really 4 different categories so that we can look at the risk individually on each one of these. So speaking about labor, we all know that labor is our highest risk on the job, and it's the most costly thing to the contractor. So I would say that you should absolutely look at your labor risk and assess it separately from all of the other topics. And we're going to show you some examples of that here in a minute. Material, a medium risk. As long as you didn't miss any material on the job, you should be pretty good with that. General expenses, pretty low risk. And your subcontractors, those that you know and you work with over time, you've got great track record with them, you should know each one of them, and that should be a pretty low risk as well. So what is the labor risk ratio? So what exactly is that? Since labor is our most volatile portion of our job, the labor risk ratio percentage provides you with a margin of error in the event that you have a bust in labor or overrun. So in other words, based on the projected profit in your estimate, if there was a labor bust, how much could you go over before you're out of pocket? So profit margin should absolutely be correlated to the project risk. So to calculate your labor risk ratio, we're going to take the total profit divided by the labor dollars. And I really believe that that percentage should be, the sweet spot should be somewhere between 20 to 25%. And what that really means is that if you were to bust your labor and you had a 20% labor coverage in your profit, you could go over by 20% in your labor and you won't be out of pocket. So as we all know, the labor risks are different on each and every project, and we need to account for that separately in each and every bid. So let's take some examples here and let's look at how we mark these jobs up differently and kind of analyze them. So on this particular slide, we've got two projects. We have project A and we have project B. Both of those projects equal the same amount of prime cost, but their material, labor, general expenses, and subcontractor amounts are vastly different. So the job B, the material is far greater than job A. Job B's labor is really more than job A's. The general expenses in job A and B are pretty close. But the subcontract value of job A is way higher than job B. Again, totaling the $350,000 in both. So some contractors would say, hey, I'm going to put 10 and 5 on it, so 10% overhead, 5% profit, and I'm going to bid the job. Obviously, if your prime cost was $350,000 and you just put a 10 and 5 on it, both jobs would go out the door at $404,250. Okay, so let's look at it where we would use the concept of evaluating our risk as it relates to the material, the labor, the general expenses, and the subcontractors, and apply the profit associated with that risk individually. So again, we have job A and B with those same costs as we just talked about before, with the prime totaling $350,000 on both of them. Our overhead, I'm putting 10% on both of those jobs because our accounting department has done an assessment of what it takes to keep the lights on for all year and have told us that our overhead is 10%. Now, hopefully, one of the topics that we're going to be doing in the future is on how to calculate overhead. And, if that is of interest to you, certainly sign up for that one. But we're going to take 10% on both of those. And now our net cost is $385,000 on both of them. Now we're going to start looking at our risk as it associates to the material, labor, general expenses, and subcontractors. So for job A versus job B, job B's material is substantially more. So I'm going to throw 8% on for my material as opposed to 5% on job A. As I manipulate these percentages down here in the profit section, in the software or even the spreadsheet that I built for this little example, the labor risk ratio percentage will dynamically calculate, and this number will be changing on both sides as I change the profits percentages on both job A and B accordingly. So the next thing that I would look at is what's my labor risk? Well, obviously job B's labor is way higher than job A's. So I'm going to apply 21.5% labor or 21.5% markup on job B, but I only need to have 13% on job A. And then I've thrown 5% on both of them for general conditions and 2% for my subs. And now when I come down and I evaluate it, as you can see, both of the jobs, I'm in what I was calling my sweet spot of 20 to 25% labor risk ratio. And again, as these percentages would be manipulated up or down, it would change this ratio. Now, now the next thing that you would need to say is, okay, so how bad do I need the work? How competitive do I need to be? What do I need to do here to give me my competitive advantage? So, then you can start manipulating, these percentages and driving this down or up if you feel you needed to. But then I think you need to also look at the overall markup of the job as well. So if I'm marked up with these percentages, giving me a 25% risk ratio on job A, I will have marked that entire job up an average of 14.31%. If I have that same 25% risk coverage on job B, I will have marked it up 27% overall on the entire job to give me a 25% labor coverage. So obviously, with something where you have less risk, you can go in with a lower markup than something that you have lots of risk on. All while looking back at, watching these percentage numbers on your labor risk ratio move up or down as you adjust those percentages. So now let's go back to the first slide that we just looked at, where we just put a 10 and 5 on it. And let's add in the labor risk ratio. And let's see, when we use the 10 and 5 markup on both sides of job A and B, what our labor risk ratio now becomes. So, wow, look at this. Because we're very low in labor risk ratio here, and we put 10 and 5 on it, it gave us a 32% labor coverage on job A. This means that if I would have looked at my labor risk ratio, and I agree that I would want to be somewhere in that sweet spot of 20 to 21%, I wouldn't have to mark it up this much. I could have went in with a lesser markup to give me more of a competitive advantage. Really didn't need to go in at 404,250, unless you know for some reason that you can be low and demand that kind of markup. But I would certainly look at it in that perspective that, I could have gone a lot lower. I didn't need to mark that up 32%. Job B, however, look at that. If I would have went at 10 and 5, man, I would have only had 8% markup on there. So now if I went over on 8% of my labor costs, I'm going to be out of pocket. I've burned all of my profit. So this again is a really great reason why you should always evaluate your labor risk ratio. So evaluating that ratio will help you to be more profitable and give you hopefully the competitive advantage, because then you can lower that if that is the case, if this was the case. Okay, so let's move on. Sorry about the flicker in the screen there. Let's move on to the next topic, and we're going to talk about costs associated with varying site conditions. So job site conditions are very different from job site to job site, and that pre-bid walkthrough, that is the time to take notice of all those differing site conditions so that you can account for those in each and every estimate. So site conditions or site logistics can greatly impact the productivity of a job site. So let's think about some examples and how they affect productivity. So in this particular little picture, we've got, we've got a job site, multi-story building with our laydown area. And we really need to look at our site logistics. Where is that field office going to be located in relation to where the work is being put in place? Also the break area. So, these types of locations or site logistics drastically affect our productivity in the field. Where is the smoking area related to the work area, the restrooms related to the work area, obviously the material laydown area, the garbage disposal area, the parking area. All of these are site logistic issues that if we don't account for them in our bid, we could incur lots of labor on site during the actual construction of the project. So here's some other ones to consider. The egress and access to the job site and what are the receiving hours. Protection of owner-occupied equipment or areas. So if you're working in, a commercial building and, the owner has occupancy in part of that building and your work has to be in that area, protecting the owner's, their occupied space is going to cost you time. So you need to make sure that you account for that in your bid process. Temporary power, lighting, or heat, who's responsible for that? And that is absolutely going to impact your labor hours. Security requirements to get onto the site. Is there anything special or is it just walk on? You need to know if there's a buck hoist or an aerial lift, what the schedule for that lift is and what kind of access you're going to have to that. Who's responsible for the dewatering plan or subsurface conditions as we're on the job site? Big factors that can affect, your productivity. If you're told that the GC is going to take care of the dewatering or somebody else, and you come in and the hole's full of water, it's going to be a problem. Soil conditions, obviously, when you have underground work to do, need to know what the soil conditions are, type A, B, or C soil, or stable rock. Those are all things that you need to know in that pre-bid walkthrough. So I would suggest, that you would create a site logistics estimating checklist, and this checklist is more of a living, breathing document that, you'll trip across something that you didn't think of, but keep adding to that list. So it becomes a checklist so that when you do your pre-bid walks, you have that checklist to check things off. Hey, did I check for dewatering? Did I check for temporary power? Blah, blah. So anyways, I would suggest that you do that. So here's 4 ways or 4 steps to mitigate site condition risks. Ensure that all the site conditions are considered in each and every estimate because they're all different. Use the RFI process to clarify site-related questions that are not addressed in your contract documents or on that pre-bid visit. So that RFI process is absolutely the one that we employ, to be able to make sure that those questions get answered. Qualify all of your unanswered questions in your bid proposal and make sure that those are called out. And I will tell you that, I've heard contractors that would say, you know what, I can't put any of that in my bid proposal. Well, my experience is this: for most projects, if you're the low bidder, you'll get to the table to talk and you can clarify, what you might have put in those clarifications in your proposal. So just sticking your head in the sand and not putting it in your letter is risk that you're taking on. So I would suggest that you always put those types of unanswered questions in your proposal and document that. If the site conditions change during construction, make sure that you notify early notification. So that doesn't matter if it's a change order or if it's site conditions, whatever it is. Early notification is always the best tool because notifying them at the end of the job, you no longer have a hammer. The job is, the work is complete and you have no hammer, and that's going to hurt you. So not recognizing our true costs associated with differing site conditions, that could be a silent killer to your project profit, absolutely. So now let's talk about spreadsheet errors. This is a pretty quick topic to talk about. Everybody loves their spreadsheets. I'm one of them. I love working in Excel. It's a very powerful tool. But it also can get you into some danger when using it, as a closeout sheet. If you don't have cells locked down, or if the people using them don't understand how to use those sheets. So anyways, some of our common spreadsheet errors that we see are data errors that happen during entry of the data, or deletion of a cell formula. So you're trucking along, entering stuff in, and you override a formula that was in a cell. Now it's a pinned value. Or incorrect cell references within formulas. You insert a row or delete a row, and now all of a sudden your sum total isn't correct. We're not saving your work, adding rows, and that sum range changes. Older spreadsheets that have errors on them and they're copied. All of these things can cost a lot of time and aggravation. So large errors will either get you the job because you made a huge error, or they're cost you the job and you didn't get it because you were way over because of some error that you made. So spreadsheet errors are very common, and these are just some of the tips in order to look out for. So in conclusion, if today's topics resonate with any of you, whether it might be applying labor factoring, at the line item detail or at the very end of your project, or analyzing labor risk ratios, or calculating site conditions, or eliminating any of those spreadsheet errors, I hope that you'll consider Trimble's estimating software, to help mitigate these project risks and increase your profitability, which in turn will allow you to bid more work. So, if speaking on the labor risk ratio, I did put together a quick little spreadsheet just to illustrate how those work. And if you'd like to see the calculations on that, by all means, reach out to us. We'll give you an email address here at the end, and reach out and ask me for those, and we'll send you that spreadsheet, and you can, examine those calculations on there to hopefully employ them in what you're using today. So the newest release to our software portfolio is TrueEst, which is a very easy to use cloud software that would help you implement these best practices that we talked about today, or ways to build better estimates. And if labor factoring resonated with you, then TrueEst could certainly help. It enables you to create a detailed labor estimate using industry standard labor units. It also allows you to factor your labor by drawing or by system, which would account for those difficult field installation situations. Or if that spreadsheet error resonated with you, electronically measuring within TrueEst, you can measure, count, mark up those drawings in a browser, automatically consolidate items in from each of your multiple takeoff sheets into a summarized view, or eliminate the possibility of deleting formulas or keying errors. TrueEst absolutely can help you with those pain points. And how about calculating overhead and profit? If TrueEst will easily allow you to add in other job-related expenses and apply your overhead and profit while evaluating that project risk. So TrueEst, powered by Trimble, it's a cloud-hosted solution. It's easy to use estimating software. In fact, I will tell you that our programming team, this has been one of the mantras that we've marched to, is that if it takes training, we failed. So we've really strived very hard with our programming and UI UX designers to make sure that this is easy to use software. If you need graphical takeoff, unlimited document storage, it has a catalog of 1 million plus items in it, many of them containing pricing. Or if you're needing Trimble or MCA industry labor, it's all included. So it's ideal for building a basic estimate for the smaller piping and plumbing projects. And for those of you on the electrical side, be watching out for our NECA labor, because it's going to be added very soon. So how do you get your free 30-day trial? So just sign up, go visit truest.trimble.com and sign up for a free 30-day trial. And in doing so, you'll be asked to create a Trimble ID, because this is how we protect the products. So you'll sign up for a Trimble 30-day ID. It's a login for your login, and you'll be off to the races. If you need more feature-rich solutions, or you're on the electrical side, until we have that electrical version out, please visit us at MEPlearning@trimble.com. So Trimble offers solutions for the complete life cycle of the job or the project, and I'd like to just hit on just a couple of them real quickly. So on the software or product side of things, we have products for estimating and takeoff, like we just talked about. We also have detailing and fabrication, whether you use an AutoCAD MEP or Revit, we have a solution for that. And then certainly moving that on to the field layout or 3D scanning. So after fabrication, you're ready to send it out to the field and need to use one of our robotic total stations. Awesome. It'll locate all your hanger points, all your sleeves, anything that you need to locate in the field. And what about services? We have BIM services, and really what that is that service is a soup to nuts type organization, where you really define what you really need from them. And if it's just staff augmentation, they can certainly help. So, during your peaks and valleys, if you get hit with a job that you need more drafting people on, they would be able to augment your staff. Or you just say, nope, I want you to do it soup to nuts. They could do the entire design for you, or drafting for you. How about 3D laser scanning services? They provide that as well. And also have training services for our software, hardware, and professional development courses. And then on to content, and I would tell you that content is one of those things that without it, and it being very robust, that software will not hum and work. So our content, Trimble content, I'll tell you, is second to none. And I think that once you see it, you'll totally agree with that. So it's constructible content. So it's not just pricing content, or not just dimensional content. It is constructible. So whether it's used in the design process, the detailing process, the estimating process, it's all, that same data. And it's managed content. So you don't have to do the update to your software for pricing, or any of the changes or adds to that content. So we represent 31 million building components. There's 5,000 MEP manufacturers, and it represents about 10,000 product lines. So it's very, very robust content. So I think you'd be very pleased with that. So with that, I hope you found the topics were informative, and if you have any questions, we'll certainly open it up to that and try to answer those.
Perfect. Thanks, Ron. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A application on the GoToWebinar module. A couple of notes, I did put a link in the chat to the TrueS sign-up steps. So if you would like to sign up for a trial, it's pretty easy. So go ahead and click that link, and that'll take you directly to the page with instructions and the link to the login page where you need to create your account. So it looks like we have one question here. Let's see. Ron, can you share your labor risk ratio calculation?
Yes, I can. So the actual calculation itself is basically just the total profit divided by the labor. So, it's a very simple calculation. And if, let me run back to that slide here. Sorry, I try to jump back as quickly as I can here. So send us your email address, and I'll send you this little spreadsheet that's associated with this slide, and it has a calculation in it. But that labor risk ratio right here of 25.2% is the total profit of 15,100 divided by my labor 60,000. That's what makes that 25% number. So anybody that would like to have the spreadsheet associated with this, I'd be glad to give it to you. Just let us know through the chat there.
Yeah, it looks like we got one request already for that, so perfect.
Okay, cool.
All right, let's see. So another question, can you provide some examples of job site conditions that change and how to handle notifying someone?
Yeah, sure. I guess some examples of maybe how site conditions or job site conditions would change would be like, okay, so I went to the pre-job or the walkthrough, and this is where they told me my material laydown area was going to be. And I got to the job, and we started offloading tools and material, and my job site laydown area has drastically been changed or moved, and now it's no longer close to where my work is going to be. It's a long ways away. Now, okay, we got to look at it within reason. If it moved, but not by much, I wouldn't worry about it too much. But it's a substantial difference. That's absolutely something that needs to be brought up. So I would actually, in that case, instead of offloading everything that second, go grab the general contractor, whoever you're working for, and say, listen, this isn't where we told we were going to be able to offload our stuff, and try to work it out that way. And notification goes to whoever your contract is with. So in that case, if it was a GC, that's who you need to notify. If it was with the owner, you need to take that up with the owner. A couple other thoughts that I might have along that line too is like temporary power or temporary lighting. If you were told that during the pre-bid walkthrough that temporary power is by others, and you get there and there's no temporary power, obviously that's a problem. So that would be a differing site condition that would require some type of a change if they weren't going to provide that. So you'd get on the horn back to the office with whoever estimated it and say, listen, I don't have temporary power here. We're going to need to address this. So the project manager would typically, talk to whoever your contract is with, the GC or the owner, and try to get that resolved. Same thing with the temporary lighting.
Great. And we have another question. Can you provide some typical correction factors?
Sure. Some of them that come off the top of my head would be something like, if I was working in a ditch, so I'd qualify that as a below grade factor. Again, you have to understand the basic assumptions of the estimating system that you're using, or the labor units, the estimating labor units. And if your basic assumption says that up to 4 feet deep in an excavation is included in my normal labor units, then I wouldn't apply a factor. But if I was deeper than 4 feet, I would want to apply a factor. And I would say something like maybe 2 to 4% per foot below grade, below that 4 foot would be something that I would add. Thinking about, we talked earlier about reduced height workspace or working in a crawl space. Those are tough. I mean, if you're in there all day long, bent over, especially if it's like 4 feet high, I mean, on your knees, I would probably put somewhere pretty steep factor, 30 to 40% on that particular type, that type of a job. But again, these are subjective. It's something that you would need to look at on each individual case. And above 10 feet in height, I would probably say that it's 1 to 2% per foot above 10 feet. And then we talked about working in a hot or cold area. I'd probably add 10 to 30% based on, the range, the temperature range that it really is. I mean, you can get some very, very cold days in the north. And I don't know that 10% is going to be enough to cover you. So think about also the joining method in which you're going to be joining this stuff together. Some of the plastics that we're using today, are wildly affected by temperature. So if you're using something that takes a hot plate and it's a butt fusion or maybe a socket fusion type process, and it's very cold, it's not going to go as well as on a warm day, obviously, so I would certainly be thinking about those things, or you're using PEX or whatever, you may want to consider it different if it's a very, very cold situation. So there's some factors that off the top of my head that I might suggest.
Great. Are there any other questions? Did anyone else have anything else they would like to ask? While we wait to see if there's any last couple of questions, I can go over a couple of additional closing items. So we do have a full webinar schedule. I will post the link in the chat here. This is where you can find a list of all of our upcoming MEP software webinars. We have a couple more to close out the year in December, and then we'll also be posting some new webinars for the new year as well. So follow that page and see if there's any webinars of interest to you. We will also be asking, as a survey will pop up at the end of the webinar after we close it, about if there are any other topics of interest or in what frequency you would like to attend these webinars. So please give us some feedback so that we can provide the knowledge and information that you need to help you become successful as an MEP estimator. And if you have any additional questions, please email those to meplearning@trimble.com. If you have any questions about TrueEst or anything that was presented today, please feel free to shoot those over. I did get a couple of names that sent over requests to get that labor risk spreadsheet, so we will get that to you as well.
Awesome.
It looks like we don't have any additional questions. So with that, Ron, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Just thank you for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about our trades and how we estimate and how to build better estimates. So I hope some of those tips or tricks will help you in the future. Thank you so much for joining.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.